Welcome to Darkness Calling Stories, where darkness whispers and fear becomes reality. If you're drawn to chilling stories, abandoned places, and tales that haunt your mind long after the video ends, then you've come to the right place. Join me by subscribing to the channel and hitting like, and I'll take you into mysterious, terrifying stories that defy explanation. Without keeping you waiting any longer, today I'm bringing you 3 stories about Uber drivers and long-haul truck drivers, and the eerie, unexplained encounters that still haunt them to this day, even though they happened long ago. The 2:17 a.m. ride. I drove for Uber in Chicago for nearly 3 years, mostly working the night shift because the tips were better and the roads were less congested. Night drivers like me get used to all kinds of passengers: drunk people, arguing couples, nurses getting off work, students heading home from bars. But there was one ride I still can't explain in any normal way. That night at around 2:17 a.m., my phone pinged with a pickup request in the South Side. The pickup spot was right in front of an old apartment building, the kind of red brick place built decades ago, with dim yellow hallway lights that looked unsettling even from the outside. I'm not a superstitious person, but for some reason, the moment I pulled over to the curb, I felt uneasy. The app showed the passenger's name as Evelyn, no profile picture. The destination was an address in the northern suburbs, more than 40 minutes away. It was a high-paying trip, so I was actually glad to get it. I waited for nearly 2 minutes before the rear passenger side door opened. A woman got into the car. I only saw her in the rearview mirror, probably in her late 50s, wearing a light gray coat, her hair neatly pinned up, her skin very pale. Not ordinary pale, but the kind of washed-out pallor you see in someone who hasn't been in the sun for a very long time. What stood out most was how completely silent she was. No greeting, no confirmation of her name, not even a question about the route. I spoke first. "Good evening, ma'am. Evelyn, right?" She gave a very slight nod. My voice dropped without me meaning it to, one as if I were afraid of disturbing someone who was asleep. I started driving. Inside the car, there was only the steady hum of the air conditioning and the sound of the tires against the road, still damp from the rain. For the first 10 minutes or so, I glanced in the mirror from time to time. She sat perfectly upright, both hands resting on her lap, staring out the window. No phone, no movement, not even a sigh. The longer I drove, the stranger it felt, because even the quietest passengers make little movements now and then. But this woman was like a statue sitting in the back seat. When we got near the overpass on the highway, she spoke for the first time. "Don't take the upper road." Her voice was very soft, raspy, as though it were coming from very far away. And I looked at the map. The app was directing me onto the overpass because it was the fastest route. I hesitated for a second, then asked, "You mean, take the lower road?" "Don't take the upper road," she repeated, this time more clearly. "Someone is going to die there tonight." I let out an awkward laugh. In this line of work, I'd met all kinds of people who said strange things. I figured maybe she had some mental health issue, or had just seen some news story about an accident. But for some reason, my hands still turned the wheel and took the lower exit. I'd been on the lower road for less than a minute when I heard a long screech from above, followed by a horrific crash. I flinched and tapped the brakes, looking up just in time to see lights swerving wildly, then an SUV flipping onto its side and skidding along the edge of the guardrail. I went cold. If I had followed the app, my car would have been right where that SUV lost control. I looked into the rearview mirror. The woman in the back seat was still sitting there, motionless. I swallowed hard and asked, How did you know?" She didn't answer, From that point on, my spine felt ice cold for the rest of the drive. Chicago's streets at night are already desolate, but that night every traffic light felt strangely unfamiliar. I just wanted the ride to end as soon as possible. Eventually, I reached the destination. It was an old-style house in Evanston with a white fence and weathered wooden steps. I pulled over and turned around to say, "We're here." The back seat was empty. I swear to you, in the split second between watching the road and turning around, I never heard a door open. I didn't hear a single sound. I panicked and jumped out of the car to check. The doors were still locked from the inside. The back seat was freezing cold, much colder than the rest of the car. On the seat there was a long, damp streak like rainwater dripping from the hem of a coat. The most terrifying part was that the app still hadn't ended the trip. It said, "Waiting for rider to exit." I looked up at the house in front of me. The porch light glowed dimly. The downstairs curtain shifted slightly as if someone were standing behind it watching. Without really knowing why, I walked up and rang the doorbell. An elderly man answered the door. When I asked whether someone named Evelyn lived there, his face changed instantly. He stood frozen for a long moment before telling me to wait. Then he came back holding an old framed photograph. The woman in the picture was the same woman who had just been sitting in my car. The old man said, almost in a whisper, "That was my wife. She died in an accident on that overpass 12 years ago. On nights when another accident is about to happen there, sometimes people say they've given her a ride home. I never got paid for that trip. And ever since that night, whenever my phone buzzes at exactly 2:17 a.m. while I'm driving through the South Side, I shut the app off immediately." The knocking at mile marker 191. I drove long-haul trucks for nearly 10 years, hauling freight from Texas to Colorado and then over to Utah. People on the outside think truck driving is just about sitting behind the wheel for hours. But those of us in the business know better. The hardest part isn't the long distance. It's the stretches of road at night that are far too empty. That year, I took a load of agricultural machine parts from Amarillo to Grand Junction. I got a later start than planned, so by the time I reached New Mexico, it was already pitch black. It was that kind of desert night where you see only two things: the road and the darkness. No houses, no gas stations, no reliable cell signal. Just the static crackle of the CB radio and the low growl of the engine like some large animal. At around 1 a.m., then I was passing through an old stretch of highway with very little traffic near mile marker 191. It was unusually cold. I remember clearly because when I looked at the temperature gauge on the dashboard, it was dropping faster than normal, even though just a few hours earlier it had still been warm. That was when the CB radio came alive. There was no clear call sign, just static, and then a distorted man's voice cut through it. "Don't stop the truck." I frowned and adjusted the volume knob. It was common for other drivers to use the same channel on roads like that, so I figured somebody was warning about an accident or maybe a robbery. I picked up the mic and answered, "Who is this? Say that again." Nothing but static. Then the voice came through again, a little clearer this time. "No matter what you see, don't stop at mile marker 191. Before I could react, the radio went dead. My skin crawled. In this line of work, people sometimes joke around with ghost stories on the road. But the way that voice sounded didn't feel like a joke. It sounded too close, as if someone were sitting right there in the passenger seat. I looked over. The seat was empty. Trying to steady myself, I kept driving. About 10 minutes later, my headlights picked out the figure of someone standing on the shoulder. It was a young woman. She was wearing a white dress that fell to her knees, her long black hair hanging loose and tangled. She stood with her back to the road, as though she were staring out into the desert. The idea of a young woman standing there in the middle of the night on a deserted highway, even with no house in sight, was already impossible enough. But as my truck got closer, she slowly turned her head. Her face was covered in blood. I hit the brakes on instinct, then suddenly remembered the warning. Don't stop the truck. The rational part of me screamed that she might really be hurt, but instinct told me that whatever I was looking at did not belong to the normal world, because there was no pain on her face, no panic, only a cold, empty expression. And her eyes, they locked onto mine as if she knew exactly what I was thinking. I clenched my jaw and kept my foot on the gas. As the front of my truck passed where she was standing, I glanced into the side mirror. She was gone. I exhaled hard, my palms slick with sweat. I told myself I had to be exhausted, that I must have imagined it. But a few seconds later, knock, knock, knock. A tapping sound came from the passenger side door of the cab. I turned my head. Outside the window, level with my eyes, that girl was running alongside my truck as it barreled down the highway at nearly 90 kilometers an hour. Her hair streamed behind her, but her body barely moved at all. One hand was pressed against the glass, and with the other she tapped in a steady rhythm, 3 knocks at a time. Her face was pressed close to the window, and her bruised lips were curled into a thin smile. I shouted and slammed my foot down on the gas so hard the engine roared. The whole truck shook. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I didn't dare look again. I just stared ahead and drove. The knocking lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped. I didn't pull over until I reached the first rest stop with lights on and a few other trucks parked there. The second I killed the engine, I jumped down and checked the passenger side door. There were 3 long handprints on the window, marked in a reddish dust that looked like dirt mixed with dried blood. An old man, another long-haul driver, saw how pale I was and asked what had happened. When I mentioned mile marker 191, he wasn't surprised. He just took a drag from his cigarette and said, years earlier, a young woman had crashed there. Her car had gone off the road on a rainy night. People said she survived for several hours and stood out there waving for help. But every driver either got scared or never saw her and kept going. They didn't find her body until morning. There was a rumor she wasn't asking for a ride. She was only looking for the ones who were about to stop, and then drove away. I didn't fully believe it until I got back to the company yard in Colorado. While they were unloading my truck, the mechanic called me over. He asked why the passenger side cab door was lightly dented, as if someone had been pounding on it from the outside for a long stretch of road. I didn't answer. It's been more than 4 years since then, and I still drive at night. But every time I pass through New Mexico and get close to mile marker 191, I switch the CB radio to silence, because once in a while, through the static, I still hear a distant man's voice repeating, "No matter what you see, don't stop the truck." The man with no reflection. I started driving for Uber in Seattle after my divorce. During the day, I worked delivery for a food warehouse, and at night I drove to help cover the rent. Winter in Seattle gets dark early with endless drizzle, and the streets always reflect headlights like a sheet of black glass. It was that wet, shimmering light that made strange things even harder to tell, apart from exhaustion and an overworked mind. That night was Christmas Eve. I had been driving until nearly 1 a.m. and was about to turn off the app and head home. But just as I was getting ready to go offline, a ride request popped up in Pioneer Square. The pickup spot was in front of an old bar. The fare was good, and the trip wasn't far. I accepted it. The passenger was a man named Martin. He was standing directly beneath a flickering neon sign, tall, thin, wearing a black overcoat and an old-fashioned fedora. The first strange thing was that in the middle of that cold rain, his coat was completely dry. Not a single drop of water clung to his shoulders or hat. He opened the front passenger door and sat down beside me. "Good evening," I said. He turned to me and gave me a very faint smile. "Please take me to this address and don't go over the bridge." And he showed me his phone screen, but what caught my attention wasn't the address. It was the way the light from the screen fell across his face as he tilted it toward me. And I suddenly had the unsettling feeling that his skin tone wasn't right. It didn't look like normal skin under blue light or yellow light. It looked like the color of an old photograph that had faded to gray. I glanced at the rearview mirror as I merged into traffic. I could see the back seat. I could see the rain-blurred rear window. I could see the headlights of the cars behind me. But I couldn't see the reflection of the man sitting right next to me. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, so I looked up directly. He was still there, hands folded together on his knees. I glanced at the mirror again. Still nothing. My whole body went cold, but I kept my voice steady. "Which bridge did you mean?" "Any bridge," he replied. "I don't like water." I let out an uneasy laugh. "That's kind of difficult in Seattle." He turned and looked at me. The smile was still there, but his eyes were not smiling at all. "You'll find another way." I checked the map. Sure enough, now there was a longer route that avoided the short bridge over the canal. I followed the new directions, though by then my mind was already spinning with strange thoughts. The streets were unusually empty. The farther we drove, the more the city seemed hollowed out. No taxis, no pedestrians, no car horns. Only the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers sweeping across the glass. It was as if Seattle had sunk beneath a thick layer of cotton, and my car was the only thing still moving. Then Martin suddenly asked, "Do you believe there are people who don't know they're dead?" My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I gave him a non-committal answer. I don't spend much time thinking about things like that. "There are people," he continued, staring straight ahead at the black road, "who leave one place, get into a car, and think they're still on their way home. They make conversation, give directions, even leave a tip. When in truth, the only thing left of them is the desire to get back." I didn't dare look at him again. As we neared the drop-off point, the map led me down a narrow, tree-lined street. At the very end stood an abandoned Victorian house, its windows boarded up, weeds overgrown in the front yard. I pulled over, my voice dry in my throat. "We're here." Martin didn't open the door. He just sat there, staring at the house through the rain streaking down the windshield. After a moment, he asked, "Do you see that house?" "Of course I do." "That's strange," he said softly. "The last time I saw it, the lights were still on." Then he turned to me. It was the first time I'd seen his eyes clearly from that close. And they didn't look old at all. They held the confusion of someone who had just awakened from a very long dream. "I remember getting into a car after a Christmas party," he said very slowly. "I remember the bridge. I remember the rain. I remember the car going over the railing." My throat locked up. "I tried to avoid her," he continued. "A woman standing in the middle of the bridge, wearing a light-colored coat. I swerved. Then there was water." His hand rested on the dashboard. I saw water begin to drip from his fingers. At first, it was only a few drops. Then, more. Cold water ran down the edge of the seat and onto the floor, carrying with it the stale, muddy smell of lake water and silt. "I can't remember the way home," he whispered. "No one will take me across the bridge." I could barely breathe. The entire car was getting cold fast, so cold that my breath began to fog in front of me. Then my phone, sitting in its mount, switched screens by itself. The ride ended. The passenger's name vanished. In its place appeared an old news alert from nowhere, as if the app had glitched. The headline was only partially visible, but I could still read it. "Local businessman Martin Hale dies after car plunges off bridge on Christmas Eve, 1987. I whipped around toward the passenger seat. It was empty. Only water remained. The seat was soaked, as if someone drenched from head to toe had been sitting there for the last hour. The car door was still locked. No sound of it opening, no footsteps, nothing. I started the car and sped out of that street so fast I nearly hit a trash bin on the curb. Well, I drove straight home and didn't accept another ride that night. The next morning, I went back with a friend because I thought maybe I had simply been so exhausted that I hallucinated the whole thing. The street was still there, but there was no Victorian house at the end of it, just an empty lot surrounded by a metal fence, and in front of a construction notice was a small sign stating that the old house had been demolished in 1998. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a long time. After that, the car always carried a faint, damp, moldy smell, no matter how many times I had the interior cleaned. But the thing I have never forgotten is that, right before he disappeared, Martin did not look frightening at all. He just looked like a man who had been lost for far too long. And even now, whenever I drive a passenger across a bridge on a rainy night, I still avoid looking at the passenger seat, because sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I get the feeling that a man in a black overcoat is sitting there in silence, staring down at the water below.